It was the first day of summer. I was 10, and my dad brought home a book for me. It was a thick blue paperback, covered with old woodblock illustrations, and the title, written in an old font, read, "The American Boy's Handybook." It became my Bible. My big brother got a book that day as well, the Field and Forest Handybook, and this was a book for men. He was 14, and more importantly, the oldest child, so he was practically there. With these books in our hands, we had launched into that summer and wreaked havoc on our property. My book taught me how to build a slingshot in a clubhouse, and Ben's book taught him how to ford a river and erect a log cabin. Our woods are still dotted with low log walls, which we never quite managed to finish. We spent a lot of time in these woods, but maybe even more in the water. Behind our house ran a river. That's what we called it, and the map named it the Williams River, but our friends like to call it a creek. They may have been right to do so, but we fought indignantly whenever they diminished it that way. At the widest parts we could wade across, and at the narrowest parts, even my 10-year-old arm could throw a stone across it. It may not have been much, but it was ours, and we were determined to conquer it. Our books described several boats we could construct, all more at home on a lake or a big river like the Mississippi than in the Little Williams, but we didn't care. We brought Dad blueprints and he brought us supplies. The first one we built out of aluminum roofing in the rough shape of a canoe. I think it's still somewhere at the bottom of our river. The next was a pontoon boat made from plywood and styrofoam. We took some liberties with the handybook's instructions. The book called for a paddle wheel, so we made one, but it wasn't very effective. We took it off and mounted a set of oars. That didn't go so well either. Ben rigged up a mast next, and fit a sail to it made from an old blue tarp. The only trouble was, sheltered at the bottom of a valley, hidden by the trees, this river never really got any wind. But we made a good impression when the tourist train came around the bend, and the air it brought with it filled our sail. Sure, we were still drifting down the river, but we looked like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, and the train laid on its whistle, and we could see everyone on the train crowding to the windows to see the two barefoot boys. We smiled and waved, and then dismantled the sail. In the end, we found the best way was to push the boat around with the pole which had been the mast, standing on the back in shorts and flannels, Green Mountain gondoliers. But the boat was heavy, drew a lot of water, and couldn't make it past the rocks at the bottom or the top of the long strait by our house, and we were itching for adventure. Ben stayed up late with his graph paper every night that week, and submitted another plan to Dad. The next day, he brought us 2 bright blue 50-gallon plastic drums. Ben's plan was to split them both down the middle and lay them flat, like hot dog buns, then attach them end to end, making 4 deep wells in a rectangle, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. Out came the saw and drill, and in a few hours we'd built something that seemed 10 times stronger and lighter than the last boat. We dragged it to the water and found to our delight that it floated, and it did it well. It was inelegant, but it was sturdy. The way we'd put it together left a few things to be desired. For a start, there were no seats, and the front of the boat was just a flat shelf that dove into the water like a dam. There was also a pocket in the very center of the boat where the 4 tubs met. Sometimes water would splash up from beneath, but we didn't think much of it. So we took the boat up and down our little stretch of river, and found it to be perfectly suitable for a longer trip. Our plan was to raft down the river about 2 miles to where the road met the river in a covered bridge. We'd never been down that far, and we didn't know what to expect, only that there was a feature to watch for, something called Doc's Waterfall. The trip would be long and hard, so we hesitated, and decided to plan something definite later. The biggest hurdle was going to be getting the boat. We would need Dad's truck, and so we put it off. I will never know whether we would have put it off forever, or eventually scheduled something with our father, because something jolted us out of our complacency. Mom, in her never-ending quest to raise her boys with just a hint of culture, signed us up for voice lessons. Well, she signed Ben up anyway, along with my older sister, to take these lessons. They were held at a house with a woman who had 8 daughters. Ben didn't want to sing, and I didn't want to spend any time in that dreadfully feminine house. Mom told us to get ready to leave, and prepare to be there all afternoon. We looked at each other, recognized a mutual dread, and we knew. It was time. To heck with planning, we thought. We had to escape, and we had just the vehicle. The boat was already at the river, so all we needed was a set of paddles and life jackets and some snacks. Ben got the supplies for the boat, I grabbed a bag of cheese sticks, and we ran to the water's edge. We pushed the boat out into the river and jumped in, paddling as we struggled with the life jackets, with every stroke expecting Mom to appear at the river to call us home. We knew she would be angry, but we had to get away, no matter the cost. Soon enough, we rounded the first bend in the river, and two things changed. First, there was no longer a chance that Mom could stop us, or anyone for that matter. And second, we were both further down the river than we had ever been. The boat glided gently over the rocks that had stopped us before, and we looked eagerly ahead to see what was coming next. An unknown river might be the most wonderful thing in the world to a couple of boys, especially boys who grew up reading stories of adventures and shipwrecks. Every bend in the river brings something entirely new, even if it is more of the same. The world drifts by, calling to be explored and used properly. Every fallen log begs to be walked across, and every sandy bank looks like an Everest, silently inviting the brave and the strong. The river widens, and the land it cuts through turns to plains, covered in brush and full of the noise of birds and insects. Then the land pushes it back into a narrow run, and the brush is replaced with tall trees which lean over the water, dropping shade and leaves. Anything might be lurking in the shadow of those trees. Bandits, monsters, or more menacingly, more boys. Every curve of the river can hold a fort, imagined or hastily constructed, with cannon logs poking through river rock parapets. All of this and more can be found on a river. But the most exciting thing to find is an island. All the best stories have an island, and we found one around the first bend. We found a stream divert from the river, and we landed the boat to explore. Following the little branch, we found that it connected back to the river after about 100 feet, cutting out a long, flat, rocky island, with one dead little tree in the middle, surrounded by a large patch of thorns. We were overjoyed. It was not much, and certainly not what I expected from all the stories I'd read. But stories can be deceiving, I thought, and this was a proper island. I knew this because we couldn't get off it without getting our feet wet. We looked through the pebbles on the edge, put a few bright ones in our pockets, claimed the island in the name of the Queen, and pushed off to drift further downstream. The day was beautiful, a perfect summer day in Vermont. Sunny, breezy, and alive. The river carried us at its pace, somewhat sideways as the boat worked itself into a more comfortable position. We paddled and watched the banks, excitedly planning our next excursion down the same stream. All the cliffs and logs, all the forts and wonders, they would have taken hours by land, and some would have been completely inaccessible if not for the boat we had made. We felt like kings, and we felt like boys. The boat didn't always fit. Sometimes when the river grew shallow, we would have to portage the boat, dragging it across white-caked rocks. When the river deepened, only the biggest rocks were left in the fast stream, and we fended them off with our paddles, holding tightly to the bucking boat when we could. The bolts groaned and the barrels struck hard, but nothing broke. Our little craft was built for adventure, and she could handle it. With every new set of rapids, our grins widened, and our love for the boat increased. The river was beautiful, but we kept looking past every turn for the rumored waterfall. Every time we heard the noise of the river get louder, or saw the waves turn to rapids up ahead, we would sit a little straighter, look further down the river, and sometimes stop the boat to investigate on foot. Most of the time we simply saw large, all very exciting, but not too dangerous. The boat handled them well, either slipping between the rocks or absorbing the shock with the deep blue plastic. We quickly learned that we had very little control over the boat. It was taking us for a ride, and we learned to hang on and hope for the best. The only thing which the boat seemed to be unable to handle was the occasional, barely submerged rock, which we would encounter in the rapids. If we hit it head-on, the boat would sometimes beach itself, The pocket at the center of the boat would catch on the rock with a jolt and hold the boat in place, and then we would have to climb out and pull it off the rock, usually without much trouble. We learned to look for them and to fend them off with the paddles, so we could continue down the stream in search of more white water. We rounded one of the many turns and heard a noise which we had never before heard from our river. It was roaring a deep, throaty roar, and we knew we'd found what we were looking for. Beaching the boat, we hopped onto the smooth round rocks on the bank and walked downstream, anticipating the waterfall. The river was wide here, and the banks were wider. In front of us was a huge rock ledge, worn smooth by past floods, which had rushed over the ground we were now walking on. Our sense of excitement grew as we got nearer. We couldn't see anything past it, but we could see that there were no trees or brush, and that this would be a new kind of landscape, one we were unused to. The banks of the river up to this point had been choked with knotweed, a soft cousin to bamboo, or overgrown with thick mixed forest. It was rare to find anything clear, and when we did, it was covered in debris left by the river, stones and boulders, mud and driftwood. Most of these places were dotted with thickets of thorns and tough grass. This place seemed to promise something different to us, however, and we clambered up the stone to see what lay beyond. Standing at the top, we froze, captivated. Rolling folds of granite cascaded down in front of us like fabric, frozen in the earth. The river had washed this bedrock smooth, and left behind none of the rounded stones we were used to, but only smooth sand trapped in the folds of the ground. Some of these folds held water, making small, clear pools. Others were dry, tiny beaches. A bird flew across my sight, at eye level and right in front of me. It must have been something common, but I remember the plumage of a bird of paradise. It flew away towards the woods, and as I followed it with my eyes, I saw a stream feeding into the river. It was cool and dark, flowing from the mossy woods onto the warm granite, and pouring down ledge after ledge into the river below. Ben and I both recognized the stream as the one which crossed our road about a mile from home, and which always gave us relief from the summer heat. One August day we had named it, ignoring whatever prosaic name it officially held. Aqua Vita, we called it, the water of life. We looked away from the stream, across the folds of granite, and finally at one another. Doc's waterfall, he asked. Paradise, I replied. Dropping our life jackets and paddles, we ran down into our newly discovered territory. This was the crowning jewel of the voyage. None of the sights we had seen came close to the beauty and adventure of this place. The bed of the valley dropped 20 or 30 feet in 100 yards, and the river turned wild. The ledge which we had crossed in such excitement broke the river into the waterfall we had been searching for. It fell about 6 or 10 feet in a wide, white cascade, and then rushed through jagged boulders in deep foaming channels until it smoothed out into something like the wide, calm river it had been before. The granite here was slick and black, with sharp corners, breaking the river into white, angry swirls. The water had scrubbed the river clean of anything small, and only the largest boulders frustrated its path. We watched the river rage. We had never seen it this angry, and we were delighted. Soon we turned back to the rocks, and followed the folds toward the woods, exploring the pools. Most of them were shallow and lifeless, simply rainwater, but where the stream branched off, we found frogs and crayfish, and even small minnows and trout. The bed of the stream carried the dark moss out of the forest, and brought earth and other greenery with it. Some grass had sprouted up by the stream, and it was dotted with flowers. A few short trees had taken root in the shallow soil, and cast a little shade over the rocks. Our bird of paradise was one of many singing from these trees. The air was free of insects, and made alive by a summer breeze coming up the valley. We splashed up the stream, with our toes buried in the deep carpet of the moss. The water was icy cold, surprising us after the sun-baked granite and the hot air of the summer. We looked up the stream and into the thick woods. From where we stood in the sunlight, the shade looked especially dark and cold. The stream poured out from between hills of dark loam, through thick hemlocks, and we knew it came from some deep cold spring high up in the mountain, hidden somewhere we had never explored. The water murmured. We shivered and stepped out onto the warm rocks. It was midday, and we were hungry. We sat on a ledge halfway between the river and the stream, looking down across the landscape, and ate our cheese sticks, stripping them clean, string by string, and washing them down with water from warm bottles. We imagined these as canteens, and our plastic grocery bag as a rugged knapsack, but the cheese sticks needed no improvement. They are already great. We ate and talked, watching the beauty of the Vermont summer roll by. The sun was hot overhead, and the roar of the river quickly faded into the back of our minds. We hadn't brought a watch, and we didn't know what time it was. It had been a while since we had pushed off the bank, and we had seen so much. Every moment had been exciting, and we felt like the day could go on forever. But we knew that we were probably near the end of our trip. We knew that we must be close to where the road meets the river in our covered bridge, and this would be our final stop. We talked about hiding the boat there and walking home. Our bare feet might complain, but our hearts would sing. And because we wouldn't have to, we would probably sing as well. Maybe composing a song about frustrating our mother's plans. It takes 10 minutes to drive to the bridge, but we had stretched it out on the river to at least 2 hours, and we wanted it to last longer. The paradise by the water let us prolong the trip, but we couldn't stay forever. The river was calling us on, and after a while we stood up, brushed the sand off our pants, and returned to the boat. Out of the water, the boat was pretty heavy for 2 young boys. We pushed and pulled it over the rock ledges, bringing the roaring foam, itching to know what was around the next bend, where we could see a touch of white water. We grinned and pushed off again, buckling our life jackets. The river carried us toward the bend in the river, and we saw a long curve of rapids, a little more rough than the water we had braved before, but nothing we thought the boat couldn't handle. I held onto my paddle in the back of the boat. Ben held onto his in the front. The compartments of the boat were somewhat articulated, and I watched the water bobbing him up and down before my half of the boat followed the same motion. The boat sped into the white water, and we felt rocks battering the bottom. We hit some of them hard and felt them redirect our craft, getting caught in the slots and grooves of our hull. The flat front dug into the waves and threw water up and over us. We grinned and paddled, loving every second, until, with a crash, we hit a rock which nearly stopped us, spinning the boat sideways. We braced ourselves as the water threw the wide boat against another rock, and then another. She kept moving, though, kept fending off the rocks, and we began to smile again. That was when we saw it. In the center of the river was another rock, tall, solid, and only barely submerged. It rose to a dull point, which made the river wash over it in a silvery bubble, and we were headed right for it. The water lifted the boat onto the rock and then dropped the point directly into the gap in the center of our boat, where the 4 compartments came together. It fit perfectly and held our boat locked in place, as the water poured up the back and swamped the boat. We tried to push it off with our paddles, but the water was too strong and heavy. This rock had conquered us. Splashing overboard, we heaved at the craft, trying desperately to free it, but it was truly stuck. We heaved at it again and again for minutes, until Ben showed me how to set my paddle underneath it as a lever, and we lifted with all our strength, the water raging around us. The boat began to move, very slowly, and then the water caught it, flipping it upside down, and carried it away, down the river. I made a dash for it, but Ben caught me. "It's too fast here," he told me. "Let's follow the riverbank and catch it at the next flat." We shouldered our paddles, unbuckled our life vests, and climbed the banks to the railroad tracks above us. The fright of the last few minutes quickly turned into excitement as the 2 of us walked down the tracks, balancing on the rails and laughing about the day. We could see the river through the trees, and the blue of the boat occasionally flashed through. It would be easy to retrieve, and we were in no hurry. We had done it, we realized. We had made it further than we ever thought we could. We had even faced destruction and defeat, and nothing could stop us now. I wondered how much further we had on the river, and looked forward to getting back in the boat. With this thought in mind, we rounded a bend in the tracks, and began to see the strait we were looking for. The river slowed to a crawl, and it would be easy to catch up with our boat. We took a few more steps, and stopped in surprise. Far at the end of the river, we could see our covered bridge, and next to it, our minivan. Sitting on the rail next to the van was our mother, with the wind blowing her dress and her eyes buried in a book. She knew what we had done, and she was waiting for us where she knew we'd end up. We watched her glance up at the river and then back into her book, and then look back up in shock. She stood slowly, and the book dropped to her side. Ben and I looked at each other in confusion, and then down into the river to see what she was looking at. What we saw was our makeshift plastic boat, battered and bruised, upside down in the middle of the stream, and completely empty of passengers. It looked like a tragedy. High on the bank, we were easy to miss, especially for someone with a mother's eyes focused on a disaster. So we broke into a sprint together, waving our paddles and our life jackets, and shouting for our mother's attention. It took a few minutes for Mom to spot us, and I think she lost a few years from her life as she watched the raft floating lazily toward her. She finally saw us running, and when we reached her, the color was starting to come back to her cheeks. We hugged her and offered 1,000 apologies all at once, while she stood there silently listening to it all. We finished, breathlessly, and waited for her response. "Go get your boat," she said. "Pull it up and hide it under the bridge, and then get in the car." She turned and walked back to the van, then called over her shoulder, "I called and rescheduled the voice lesson. You're still going,